Thank you. My name's Mark, and I'm grateful to be here, grateful for all the input and what everybody shared. The last gentleman, who's a truck driver, talked about trauma, and I asked somebody, has that been touched on today? And they said no, so I felt led to speak. In a court hearing, there was a Harvard PhD psychiatrist who spent 2 years on the streets working with people who are unhoused. She equated the trauma level of the traumatic dislocations, the forced evictions of people in tent encampments, to the level of a natural disaster. And I thought about that, and there was a period where they were one every 2 or 3 weeks, then there was one a week, then there was 2 a week, and then lately there's been 3 a week. This week there's just one. But as someone who serves and supports people in the community who are unhoused, I agree that there's the build up and the lead up. When are we gonna get moved? When are we gonna be told we have to leave?
Where do we go?
That whole build up is a traumatic thing in itself. It's the anticipation, the anxiety. When are they gonna tell us we have to go? Where are we gonna go? The second phase is the day of the actual traumatic eviction. It's very traumatic. I feel like I've probably been to serve and support at 25 out of those 34 that were mentioned. And I can tell you that it's very traumatic. And what people don't see after the city apparatus leaves is the trauma when you go around the neighborhood and you see people crying and talking and yelling and laying on the ground, completely exasperated and exhausted. And then there's the aftermath of the storm, which goes on for days and weeks. And mostly in the aftermath, those individuals are traumatically dislocated again. So what we have is a cumulative distress, traumatic distress, one after another, that builds and builds and builds. The outreach teams do their thing. I appreciate a lot of the work that they do, but unfortunately, it's woefully inadequate. We are not fully appreciating the impacts of these traumatic dislocations. We're not fully appreciating the psychosocial impacts, the emotional, psychological trauma. And by the way, Dr. Sorensen stated that the trauma level not only impacts the residents being evicted from their tent encampments, it affects the people that are implementing the evictions. So if the city doesn't think, and I know the police say we're trained to put up with all this, if the city does not understand that this is impacting their own employees that affect these traumatic dislocations, they're going to find out over time the long-term impacts in terms of medical leave and other workman's comp and so forth. So I just want to share that this psychiatrist was asked, are there any studies being done on this? No. And the reality is that the city and the major organization in the city should be conducting health risk assessments, health impact assessments, ongoing research, study, interviewing, surveys to understand the long-term and short-term and mid-term implications of these traumatic dislocations. They're significant. We can't fully appreciate. It was touched on the people who suffered from frostbite. That's just Anschutz. If you go to Swedish and Denver Health and so forth, it's going to be big numbers that suffered from frostbite. Those are complicated cases, long-term. So we're not my sense is, if I could share today in humility, we're not fully appreciating and understanding and taking time to understand the impacts, the trauma on our unhoused residents and on the community. That's a cumulative deficit effect that's growing and morphing and compounding, and we really need to stop, and we really need to put some real intention into this, from my own humble opinion.
Okay, appreciate it.